Today we are witnessing something that history will remember: the crumbling of one of the most brutal blockades in modern times. For years, Gaza has been suffocated under a policy that denied not just goods and medicine, but dignity, freedom, and the basic right to life itself. And now, as the blockade cracks and Palestinians pour into the streets in celebration, the world sees a truth it can no longer ignore. This is not only about Gaza or Israel, this is about power, about imperialism, about who controls the future of global politics. The fall of Israel's blockade on Gaza represents a moment that goes far beyond the borders of the region itself, and it is worth unpacking carefully because this is not simply an isolated event. For years, the blockade was more than a military strategy. It was a political statement meant to demonstrate control and domination, designed to squeeze an entire population into submission. Food, medicine, fuel, building materials, basic necessities were rationed, withheld, and used as bargaining chips. Families lived in fear of whether hospitals would have the supplies they needed, whether clean water would be available, whether children would have any chance at a normal life. What collapsed with the blockade, therefore, was not only a wall of steel and surveillance, but the illusion that this form of collective punishment could go on indefinitely without sparking a turning point. When Palestinians celebrated in the streets, it was not only a celebration of immediate relief, but a celebration of dignity regained, however briefly, in the face of a policy that had sought to erase it. To understand the scale of this moment, we must recognize how rare it is for blockades of this magnitude to be broken, particularly in the modern geopolitical landscape. States with military superiority, especially when backed by global powers, are rarely challenged in ways that yield visible results. The fact that the blockade fell signals a profound shift. The machinery of repression met the force of international solidarity, and for once it was solidarity that prevailed. Imagine the scene: convoys of aid ships arriving under global watch, banners raised, chants echoing across Gaza's shores, and a world that for too long has looked away suddenly being forced to acknowledge what it was witnessing. This is the kind of image that lingers in political memory, the kind that can redefine narratives for decades. What makes this moment so politically rich is that it came not through armed conflict, but through people, ordinary and extraordinary, who refused to stay silent. The blockade was meant to isolate, to make Palestinians feel alone and powerless, yet the very act of breaking it was made possible by a flotilla that gathered support from multiple continents, bringing doctors, activists, journalists, and even politicians who understood that this was about more than aid. It was about visibility. It was about piercing the controlled silence that has surrounded Gaza for years. And once that veil was torn, celebrations inside Gaza carried a message to the world: we are still here, we endure, and we will not vanish no matter how tight the grip of occupation becomes. The hooks in this moment are striking. One is the undeniable reality that Israel, despite its military superiority, could not prevent the breach without exposing itself further to international backlash. Another is the fact that the blockade's collapse comes at a time when U.S. influence in the region is weaker than it has been in decades, leaving Israel more vulnerable to global scrutiny. And perhaps the most compelling hook of all is the symbolism. The blockade was never just about physical restriction, it was about psychological domination. By celebrating in the streets, by raising flags, by chanting in defiance, Palestinians shattered the narrative of helplessness that the blockade was designed to enforce. The historic breakthrough of the blockade forces us to re-examine long-held assumptions. For years, we were told the blockade was necessary for security. We were told it was temporary. We were told it was a matter of defense. Yet what fell with the blockade was the credibility of those claims. If this system of control can be broken once, it can be broken again, and every break, every breach, every moment of relief adds to a larger momentum that no amount of military hardware can fully suppress. What happened here is not just a political setback for Israel, it is a symbolic victory for all who have resisted, spoken out, and demanded that the world not look away from Gaza's suffering. That is why this breakthrough matters. It is not just about what was delivered in aid shipments, but about what was delivered in hope, in solidarity, and in the reminder that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can and do fall. The global flotilla that pushed through to Gaza is perhaps one of the most striking developments in recent political memory, and its meaning extends far beyond the aid it carried. To many, these ships represented hope, food, medicine, and immediate relief. But beneath the surface, they carried something even more powerful, a collective refusal to let Gaza remain invisible, a message of resistance written across the seas. When a coalition of nations, activists, and organizations from every corner of the world came together to assemble this flotilla, they were saying something profound: that the blockade was not simply an Israeli issue, not simply an American-backed policy, but a global stain on human conscience. And by sailing through those waters, they converted what was once a local humanitarian crisis into an international political challenge that the world could not easily dismiss. The image of ships approaching Gaza's shore, carrying flags from different countries, is not an accident of history. It is a deliberate challenge to a system that thrives on isolation. Blockades are meant to make people invisible, to lock them away in silence where their cries are unheard and their suffering unseen. But when international ships arrive with doctors from South America, journalists from Europe, engineers from Asia, and volunteers from Africa, the blockade is pierced not only physically but symbolically. It is no longer just Gaza's fight, it is the world's fight. That is why the flotilla is so much more than humanitarian aid. It is a declaration that international solidarity has teeth, that it can mobilize, organize, and physically alter the course of events. Hooks emerge here that no political analyst can ignore. The first is the unprecedented scale of unity. It is rare in today's fractured global landscape for nations and civil society groups to rally around a single cause in such visible, coordinated ways. Yet the flotilla accomplished just that, bridging divides of culture, language, and ideology to bring forth one powerful message: oppression is not acceptable anywhere, and when it is exposed, people will rise to confront it. Another hook lies in the timing. The flotilla emerged at a moment when global audiences are increasingly skeptical of narratives handed down by powerful states, with social media amplifying images of suffering, with independent journalists reporting from the ground, and with movements across the global south challenging Western dominance. The flotilla hit a nerve. It told people everywhere that this was not merely an issue of Middle Eastern politics, but a question of global justice. The political weight of this action is also magnified by the risks it carried. Every participant on those ships knew the danger they faced: interception by Israeli naval forces, detention, or even violence. Yet they sailed anyway. That decision transformed them into symbols of defiance, of a willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder with the besieged, even at personal risk. In politics, symbols matter as much as strategies, and in this case, the flotilla became a symbol of courage that the blockade could not erase, a living example of solidarity in action. When Palestinians celebrated on the shore, they were not only welcoming supplies, but affirming that the world had not abandoned them, that their struggle resonated far beyond the walls of Gaza. The ripple effects of this flotilla are likely to stretch far into the future. It has already forced conversations in parliaments, newsrooms, and international institutions that once avoided Gaza's reality. It has forced governments to respond, to either align themselves with the principles of human rights or reveal themselves as complicit in silence. And perhaps most importantly, it has inspired ordinary people. The image of international ships defying the blockade speaks to a universal truth: that when enough people stand together, even the most fortified systems of control can be shaken. This is where the deeper hook lies. The flotilla redefines the terms of engagement. Israel, backed by Washington, has long dictated the narrative that Gaza is isolated, dangerous, and beyond the reach of global sympathy. But the flotilla punctured that narrative with a single, unforgettable act. By arriving in Gaza, it showed that solidarity is not abstract, not symbolic, but real, material, and capable of rewriting the story. That moment, captured in celebrations and headlines, echoes a simple but powerful truth: walls cannot last forever, seas cannot be fully controlled, and blockades, no matter how tight, are not immune to the will of the people when it manifests across nations. For decades, support for Israel has been described as ironclad, an unshakable alliance that guaranteed Israel the political cover and military aid it needed to pursue policies others would not dare defend. Yet what we are witnessing now is the slow but undeniable erosion of that very backing, an erosion accelerated by the fall of the blockade. The United States still provides billions in military aid, still shields Israel in the United Nations, still repeats the language of security as justification for almost every action. But the cracks are visible. Washington's capacity to dominate global narratives is weaker than it once was, and Israel's reliance on that dominance has become a liability. When the blockade was breached, it exposed not only Israel's vulnerability, but also America's diminishing ability to impose silence on the international stage. The global reaction to the blockade's collapse reveals just how far U.S. influence has waned. In earlier decades, American administrations could mobilize European allies, pressure the United Nations, and shape media coverage to protect Israel from serious criticism. But this time, even long-standing allies hesitated. Public opinion in Europe has shifted dramatically, with demonstrations filling the streets of London, Paris, Berlin, and Madrid in support of Gaza. In Latin America, governments that once tread carefully in their criticism of Washington now openly speak of colonial oppression and imperialist hypocrisy. In the Middle East, U.S. credibility is at one of its lowest points in living memory, eroded by the Iraq War, the Afghan withdrawal, and Washington's clear double standards in applying international law. This is the context in which the blockade fell, and it is why the fallout reverberates far beyond Israel. The hooks here are undeniable. The first is that the United States no longer controls the stage. Social media platforms, independent journalism, and grassroots movements have pierced the monopoly that Washington and its allies once enjoyed over the framing of events. When video footage of the flotilla's arrival spread across the world in real time, it became impossible to suppress or distort the story. The old playbook of dismissing criticism as biased or terrorist sympathies simply did not hold. Another hook lies in domestic politics. Within the United States itself, especially among younger generations, there is growing disillusionment with unconditional support for Israel. Polls show sharp divides between older and younger voters, between the political establishment and the public. Members of Congress face mounting pressure from grassroots movements, labor unions, and activist groups that insist U.S. foreign policy must align with principles of justice rather than blank checks for occupation. What makes this moment even more significant is that Washington is stretched thinner than ever before. Confrontations with China over trade and Taiwan, military entanglements with NATO in relation to Russia, and economic instability at home leave little room for the same kind of relentless defense of Israel that once defined U.S. policy. The fall of the blockade dramatizes this tension. To stand firmly by Israel at this moment risks even further isolation for Washington in the global South, where nations increasingly resist being drawn into Western-dominated alignments. Yet to distance itself risks alienating one of its closest allies in the region. This is the trap in which U.S. foreign policy now finds itself, and the breach of the blockade has made it even more visible. The weakening of U.S. backing does not mean Washington will abandon Israel tomorrow, but it does mean that Israel can no longer count on the same unquestioned, automatic support it has relied on for generations. Each moment like this one, the fall of a blockade, the rise of international solidarity, makes it harder for American leaders to justify their stance to the world and even to their own citizens. And here lies the most powerful hook. The very system of dominance that once seemed untouchable is now visibly unstable. If U.S. influence continues to erode, if Israel continues to press forward with policies that isolate it further, then the alliance that once looked like a pillar of permanence may turn out to be far more fragile than it appeared. This is why the fall of the blockade matters politically as much as it does humanitarianly. It is a mirror held up not only to Israel's power, but to America's declining ability to enforce the global order it once commanded. And in that mirror, the The world sees what the future may look like: a multipolar order in which even the most entrenched alliances face pressures they cannot indefinitely withstand. Palestine has once again become more than a place, more than a people struggling under occupation. With the fall of the blockade and the celebrations that followed, it has turned into a symbol that resonates across borders and across generations, a rallying point for global resistance. History gives us examples of moments when local struggles transformed into universal ones. Vietnam was not just about Southeast Asia, it was about the limits of empire and the moral bankruptcy of endless war. South Africa's apartheid system was not merely a regional injustice, it was a litmus test for whether the world would tolerate legalized racism. In the same way, Gaza is now stepping into that symbolic role, standing as proof that oppression, even when backed by the most powerful allies, is not eternal. Every chant in Gaza's streets, every image of the flotilla's arrival, every celebration of people breaking through years of siege echoes with that broader meaning. What makes Palestine so uniquely powerful as a symbol is the persistence of its struggle. For over 7 decades, Palestinians have endured displacement, occupation, bombardment, and blockade, and yet they remain. That resilience, that refusal to vanish, is what fuels its symbolic power globally. When the blockade fell, even temporarily, it wasn't only Palestinians who felt victory, it was millions of people worldwide who have marched, protested, written, spoken, and organized in solidarity with them. It was a confirmation that their efforts were not in vain, that history can still bend under the pressure of collective resistance. Gaza, in this way, becomes more than geography. It becomes an emblem of defiance against systems that seek to crush the weak beneath the weight of the strong. The hooks here are striking and deeply emotional. One is the moral clarity of the Palestinian cause. Unlike many conflicts that are clouded by complexity or ambiguity, the blockade exposed a blunt reality: a population cut off from the world, denied medicine, food, and freedom of movement, punished not for crimes committed but for who they are. That clarity makes it a natural rallying point for global activists who want a cause that speaks directly to human rights, dignity, and justice. Another hook is the way the Palestinian struggle links itself to broader movements against oppression. From Ferguson to Cape Town, from Chile to Kashmir, protest banners often carry the Palestinian flag because people see in it a reflection of their own struggles. The fall of the blockade reinforces that link. If Palestine can break through, then perhaps other battles against injustice can find their moment as well. Palestine as a symbol of global resistance also forces uncomfortable questions for governments and institutions that claim to uphold freedom and democracy. How can leaders who champion international law in one case remain silent in another? How can governments that condemn human rights abuses elsewhere defend the collective punishment of Gaza? These contradictions are harder to hide when images of Palestinians celebrating reach audiences everywhere. And as those contradictions grow more visible, so too does the strength of Palestine's symbolic role. It reveals not only the brutality of occupation, but also the hypocrisy of those who enable it. The symbolic power of Palestine does not exist in isolation, it grows in proportion to global discontent with the current order. In a world facing widening inequality, economic crises, climate emergencies, and the failures of neoliberal governance, people are searching for symbols of resistance, for stories that remind them change is possible. Gaza now occupies that space. Its resilience speaks to workers who feel exploited, to communities facing state violence, to nations resisting imperial domination. This is why every crack in the blockade, every breach of silence, reverberates so widely. It is not just about Palestinians, it is about the universal human desire to live free of domination and humiliation. And perhaps the deepest hook is this: symbols, once formed, cannot easily be destroyed. No matter how much military force is deployed, no matter how many walls are built, the image of Palestinians enduring and celebrating under impossible conditions cannot be erased. Like Vietnam and South Africa before it, Gaza has crossed a threshold. It is no longer just a conflict to be managed, it is a moral test for the world, a measuring stick of where people and governments stand in the larger battle between domination and freedom. With the fall of the blockade, That test has been made clearer than ever, and Palestine's role as a symbol of global resistance has been firmly written into our time. The weakening of the blockade is not simply a regional story, but part of a much larger global shift that is reshaping power dynamics before our very eyes. For decades, the United States and its closest allies dictated the terms of international politics with little serious challenge. They enforced sanctions, launched interventions, and offered unconditional backing to states like Israel, confident that their dominance would keep dissent in check. Yet the breach of the Gaza blockade comes at a moment when this dominance is unraveling, when the world is increasingly multipolar, and when nations once treated as peripheral are asserting themselves with newfound confidence. The fact that this blockade fell in the context of such a shift is not accidental, it is a reflection of it. We must consider what the blockade symbolized. It was never only about Gaza, it was a projection of control. Israel maintained it with Washington's support to demonstrate that resistance could be contained, that global outcry could be neutralized, that the imbalance of power was absolute. But when the flotilla broke through and celebrations erupted in Gaza, it showed that this narrative of control is weakening. The power of Washington and Tel Aviv to dictate outcomes is no longer unquestioned, and that connects directly to the larger transformation underway in global politics. Hooks emerge here that demand attention. One is the rise of alternative centers of power. China and Russia challenge U.S. dominance economically and militarily, while countries in the global south, from Brazil to South Africa to Turkey, demand a louder voice in global institutions. Another hook lies in economic realities. The United States faces staggering debt, political paralysis, and rising inequality at home, making it harder to sustain its role as the world's unchallenged enforcer. Against this backdrop, the blockade's fall looks less like a local disruption and more like a symptom of a broader decline in American influence. It is a visible reminder that even the strongest alliances cannot indefinitely impose their will when the global balance is shifting beneath them. The flotilla's success was possible precisely because the world is changing. Nations and movements that once felt powerless to defy U.S. Israeli policy now sense opportunity. They understand that Washington no longer commands the same level of obedience it once did, and they are willing to act on that realization. By participating in the flotilla, countries and activists alike seize the moment to demonstrate that global solidarity can directly undermine one of the most entrenched policies of the modern era. In doing so, they expose the fragility of the old order and the possibilities of the new one. This is where the symbolic and the structural meet. The blockade fell because the broader geopolitical terrain is no longer as favorable to Israel and the United States as it once was. Every military conflict, every economic crisis, every political scandal that weakens Washington also weakens its ability to provide cover for policies like the blockade. And when that cover weakens, resistance has more space to succeed. Gaza, therefore, becomes not only a symbol of resistance, but also a case study in the limits of empire in the 21st century. The hooks deepen when we consider how quickly these shifts can accelerate. Once symbols of absolute control begin to crack, they often fall faster than expected. Few predicted how swiftly the Berlin Wall would collapse, how rapidly apartheid South Africa would give way, or how suddenly the U.S. would withdraw from Afghanistan. The blockade's fall fits within this tradition of seemingly permanent systems, revealing their fragility in moments of unexpected rupture. And the question it poses is simple but powerful. If this can happen in Gaza, what else that we were told is impossible might also crumble under the weight of changing global realities. What we are witnessing, then, is not only a humanitarian victory, but a political turning point. The weakening of U.S. dominance, the rise of alternative powers, and the success of coordinated global action all converge in this moment. The blockade, once a symbol of unshakable control, has now become a symbol of limits. And in those limits, a new chapter of world politics is being written, one in which the balance of power no longer belongs exclusively to the few but increasingly to the many. The fall of the blockade has opened a door that was long believed to be permanently sealed, but what lies beyond that door remains deeply uncertain. History tells us that moments of rupture can move in very different directions. They can lead to progress, recognition, and justice, or they can provoke backlash, repression, and renewed cycles of violence. The celebration in Gaza is a powerful testament to resilience and hope, but it also raises the pressing question of how Israel and the United States will respond to this sudden shift. Will they see in this moment an opportunity to reimagine a future built on coexistence, or will they treat it as a threat that must be crushed before it sets a precedent? That tension defines the uncertainty of the future, and it is what makes this breakthrough both exhilarating and precarious. One possible path is escalation. Israel may view the breach of the blockade not as a wake-up call but as a humiliation that demands retaliation. In this scenario, military strikes, tighter controls, or political crackdowns could be deployed to reassert authority and remind Palestinians of the costs of defiance. The United States, despite its weakening global influence, may choose to double down on its support, pouring in more aid, vetoing more resolutions, and attempting to frame the breach as an aberration rather than a turning point. If this path is pursued, the world could see even harsher conditions imposed on Gaza, justified once again under the banner of security. This hook is crucial because it reminds us that victories can be fragile, that every celebration carries within it the risk of reprisal, and that the struggle for freedom is rarely linear. Yet another path is possible. The breach of the blockade could force a recalibration, even if reluctantly. Israel faces growing isolation, its policies are increasingly condemned in global forums, and even its allies are beginning to question the sustainability of endless occupation. For Washington, the cost of defending these policies in the face of global outrage grows heavier with every incident. The fall of the blockade might, therefore, push both Israel and the United States to reconsider their strategies, not because of sudden moral awakenings, but because the political, economic, and diplomatic costs of maintaining the status quo are rising. This path, fragile though it may be, holds the potential for incremental steps toward recognition, dialogue, and a future that acknowledges Palestinian rights in ways long denied. The hooks that emerge here are grounded in possibility. One is the power of precedent. Once a blockade has been broken, it becomes harder to claim it is unbreakable. Every future attempt to impose such control will carry the memory of this breach, encouraging resistance and emboldening those who support it. Another hook lies in the visibility of the moment. The world saw the flotilla arrive, saw Palestinians celebrate, saw the blockade falter. That visibility itself is a political weapon, making it harder to return to business as usual without facing questions, protests, and renewed pressure. The uncertainty of this moment is magnified by the broader shifts in global politics. The decline of U.S. dominance, the rise of multipolarity, and the growing assertiveness of the global South all shape the choices that lie ahead. Israel and the United States are no longer operating in a world where their narratives go unchallenged, and that changes the calculus. If they attempt to reimpose total control, they risk further alienation. If they move toward compromise, they risk setting precedents they have long resisted. This tension ensures that whatever comes next will be consequential, not only for Palestine and Israel, but for the wider international system. And here lies the deepest hook. Uncertainty itself can be a form of power. For Palestinians, this moment demonstrates that change is possible, that the structures of oppression are not immutable. For Israel and the United States, uncertainty is destabilizing, forcing them to confront vulnerabilities they once dismissed. For the global community, it is a call to action, an invitation to shape what comes next rather than watching passively from the sidelines. The blockade's fall is both an ending and a beginning, a rupture in a long and painful history that now opens onto an unknown future. Whether that future is defined by renewed repression or by steps toward justice depends not only on the choices of states, but on the continued will of people everywhere who refuse to let this moment pass in silence. Let me close by reminding us of this. Celebrations are not the end, they are the beginning. The fall of the blockade is not just a relief for Gaza, it is a lesson for the world. That when people unite across borders, when they refuse to be intimidated, when they insist on justice, they can make the impossible real. The task now is to build on this momentum, to demand accountability, to insist that this victory not be temporary, but part of a broader transformation. Because if history teaches us anything, it is this: empires fall, but people endure. And today, the people of Gaza remind us of that truth.